Sarah Mitchell's car lurched to a stop, her coffee cup tumbling to the floorboard as she stared through the windshield in disbelief. Two dogs stood trembling on the cracked asphalt, a German shepherd with haunting blue eyes and a smaller pit mix, both rising on hind legs with front paws pressed together in an unmistakable prayer position. This wasn't normal dog behavior. This was learned desperation. Mrs. Henderson dropped her grocery bags on her porch, canned goods rolling down the steps. "Dear God," she whispered, her weathered hand flying to her chest. The metallic clatter echoed through the suddenly silent suburban street as neighbors emerged from doorways, phones already recording. Sarah's breath caught as she recognized the faded tattoo in the shepherd's ear, the same K-9 unit markings from Westfield Elementary 3 years ago. The day her son Tommy died, the day this dog had failed to save him. "Call animal control," someone shouted from across the street. "Now!" But as the shepherd's desperate blue eyes met hers through the glass, one question burned through Sarah's grief-stricken mind. What had broken these animals so completely that they'd learned to beg for mercy like children? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell had always believed that 52 was too young to feel invisible. Yet here she was, sitting in her Honda Civic on Maple Street, questioning when exactly she'd become a ghost in her own life. The divorce papers had been finalized 6 months ago. 23 years of marriage reduced to a stack of legal documents and the bitter taste of irreconcilable differences. Her children, once the center of her universe, now lived their own lives 3 states away, calling dutifully every Sunday with updates that felt more like weather reports than real conversation. The modest duplex she now called home sat like a tired sentry on the edge of Lakewood, Ohio, its yellow siding faded from too many harsh winters and not enough care. Inside, her mother Margaret waited with the patience of someone slowly losing pieces of herself to Alzheimer's, though her 78-year-old spirit still burned bright during the increasingly rare lucid moments. Margaret had been a school teacher for 40 years, the kind who remembered every student's name and never missed a parent conference. Now she sometimes forgot Sarah's face, calling her by her sister's name or asking when her long-dead husband would be home for dinner. Sarah worked part-time at the Lakewood Public Library, shelving books and helping elderly patrons navigate the computer system. It wasn't the life she'd imagined at 18 when she'd been accepted to Case Western's pre-veterinary program. That dream had died quietly when she'd met Robert at a college party, when love had seemed more important than anatomy classes and organic chemistry. She'd convinced herself that being needed was enough, that purpose could be found in packed lunches and soccer practices and school fundraisers. But Tommy had changed everything. Her youngest, her surprise baby who'd arrived when she was 35 and thought her family was complete. Golden-haired and fearless, with a laugh that could fill their entire house and a habit of rescuing wounded birds from the backyard. He'd been 7 when the shooting happened at Westfield Elementary, 7 when a troubled teenager with his father's hunting rifle had stolen 8 young lives in the span of 4 minutes. The financial reality of single motherhood at 52 was harsher than any romance novel had prepared her for. The divorce settlement barely covered Margaret's medications and the specialized care she'd soon need. Sarah's bank account held exactly $347, and her credit cards were already singing their maxed-out song of financial desperation. Yet something deeper than money or stability had died with Tommy. Her sense of purpose, her belief that protecting the people you love was possible, her faith that good intentions and careful planning could shield a family from random tragedy. She'd spent 3 years in a fog of grief, counseling and antidepressants, going through the motions of living while feeling like she was drowning in slow motion. Now, staring at these 2 broken animals performing their heartbreaking pantomime of supplication, Sarah felt something stir in her chest that she'd thought was gone forever. The fierce, protective instinct that had once driven her to check under beds for monsters and insist on car seats long past the recommended age. Sarah's trembling fingers fumbled with her phone's camera as she stepped out of the car, the autumn air sharp against her skin. The German shepherd's blue eyes, an almost unnatural shade that seemed to glow in the late afternoon light, tracked her movement with an intelligence that made her breath catch. Those eyes held stories, trauma, and something that looked disturbingly like hope. The smaller dog, a pit bull mix with a coat the color of burnished copper, swayed on her hind legs before collapsing with a soft whimper. Sarah could see the infected wound on the dog's left flank, angry red and weeping, the kind of injury that spoke of deliberate cruelty rather than accident. Her pre-veterinary training, dusty from 3 decades of disuse, kicked in with surprising clarity. "Easy, girl," Sarah whispered, approaching slowly with her hands visible. The German shepherd, clearly the protector of the pair, positioned himself between Sarah and his injured companion, but his stance wasn't aggressive. It was pleading, desperate, the body language of someone who had exhausted all other options. Margaret's voice drifted from the duplex's front porch, confused but concerned. "Sarah, honey? What's happening out there?" Her mother stood in the doorway wearing her favorite blue cardigan, the one with the small moth hole near the left pocket that she refused to let Sarah mend. On her good days, Margaret was still formidable, still the woman who had once faced down an angry school board to protect her students' art program. "Stay inside, Mom," Sarah called back, pulling up the contact for Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the mobile veterinarian she'd found online 6 months ago when a stray cat had turned up in their backyard. "I'll be right there." The German shepherd's ear bore a faded tattoo, a series of numbers that made Sarah's stomach lurch with recognition. K9 Unit 447, the same unit number she'd memorized from the police reports, the one that haunted her dreams and therapy sessions. This was the dog that was supposed to protect the children at Westfield Elementary. This was the dog that had arrived 30 seconds too late to save her Tommy. Dr. Rodriguez answered on the 3rd ring, her voice professional but warm. "This is Elena. Dr. Rodriguez, it's Sarah Mitchell. I have an emergency situation. 2 dogs, one with a severe wound, both showing signs of abuse. Can you come to Maple Street?" Sarah's voice cracked as she watched the shepherd lower himself to the ground, still maintaining that heartbreaking prayer position with his front paws. "I can be there in 20 minutes. Keep them calm, and don't try to treat the wounds yourself." Infection from animal bites can be serious. The veterinarian paused. "Sarah, I have to ask, what's your relationship to these animals? Are they strays?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, watching as neighbors began to emerge from their houses. Mrs. Chen from across the street stood on her porch with her arms crossed, while Jake Morrison, the 19-year-old who lived 2 doors down, approached with his phone already recording. "I think they're asking for help." The cost estimate hit her like a physical blow. Emergency veterinary care, especially after hours, could easily run $800 or more. Sarah had $347 in her checking account and a maxed-out credit card that hadn't seen a payment in 2 months. The mathematics of compassion didn't add up. Margaret appeared beside her with surprising stealth, her lucid moments often accompanied by an almost supernatural awareness of what mattered most. "Some things are more important than money, honey," she said, her weathered hand finding Sarah's shoulder. "Remember what your grandmother used to say? The Lord helps those who help others first." Jake's phone was definitely recording now, the red light blinking as he narrated to his social media followers. "Guys, you're not going to believe this. These dogs are literally praying, like actually praying for help." His teenage audience was already responding with heart emojis and shocked face reactions. Mrs. Henderson had recovered from her initial shock and now stood at the edge of her property, grocery bags forgotten. "Those animals look dangerous," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd lived through 8 decades of neighborhood drama. "You should call animal control before someone gets hurt." The distant rumble of a truck engine made Sarah's heart race. Animal control operated out of the county facility, and their response time was notoriously swift when dangerous animals were reported. If they arrived before Dr. Rodriguez, these dogs would be loaded into cages and transported to a facility where their chances of survival, given their obvious trauma and the pit bull's breed, would be slim to none. Sarah made the decision that would change everything. She sat down on the cold asphalt, making herself small and unthreatening, and extended her hand, palm up, toward the German shepherd. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice carrying 3 years of unspoken grief and a mother's instinct that transcended species. "I see you. I see what they did to you, and I'm going to help." The shepherd's blue eyes held hers for a long moment before he slowly, carefully, placed his massive paw in her outstretched palm. The animal control truck rounded the corner at exactly 4:15 p.m., its diesel engine cutting through the suburban quiet like a death knell. Officer Tom Brady, no relation to the quarterback as he constantly reminded people, emerged from the cab with the weary efficiency of someone who'd seen too many situations that started with good intentions and ended with paperwork and euthanasia orders. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs as Brady approached, his equipment jangling with each step. The catch pole, the heavy gloves, the dart gun holstered at his side, all the tools of a system designed more for containment than compassion. Behind him, the truck's kennels waited like metal coffins, and Sarah could almost hear the countdown clock that had started ticking the moment her neighbor had made that call. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from those animals," Brady said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of 2 decades in animal control. He was younger than Sarah had expected, maybe 45, with graying temples and eyes that had seen too many animals die because their owners couldn't or wouldn't take responsibility. "We've had reports of aggressive behavior." "They're not aggressive," Sarah stood her ground, positioning herself between Brady and the dogs. The German shepherd had moved closer to her, his massive body trembling but protective, while the injured pit mix lay on her side, panting heavily. "They're traumatized. There's a difference." Brady's expression softened slightly, but protocol was protocol. "I understand your concern, but these animals need to be evaluated by professionals. Do you know who owns them?" He pulled out his scanner, a device that could read microchips and identify registered animals. The beeping sound made the shepherd flinch, a reaction that spoke volumes about his recent experiences with authority figures. Margaret chose that moment to appear beside them, moving with the surprising speed that sometimes accompanied her Alzheimer's episodes. She looked directly at Brady with the piercing gaze that had once made misbehaving students confess their crimes before she'd even asked. "Tommy Brady," she said, her voice carrying decades of teacher authority. "I remember you from my 5th grade class. You were the boy who brought me wildflowers every Friday." Brady's professional demeanor cracked. "Mrs. Mitchell, Yes, ma'am. That was a long time ago." The recognition in his eyes was genuine, and Sarah watched something shift in his posture. Margaret's memory might be failing, but her ability to see straight to people's hearts remained sharp as ever. "You grew up to be exactly what I thought you would," Margaret continued, her lucid moments often accompanied by an almost supernatural clarity about what needed to be said. "Someone who protects the innocent." "These dogs are innocent, Tommy. Hurt, but innocent." The scanner beeped, and Brady's face changed as he read the information. "K9 Unit 447 registered to David Coleman on Birch Street." He looked up at Sarah with new understanding. "This is a police dog. Retired." Sarah felt the world tilt slightly. David Coleman? The veteran who lives over on Birch? She knew the name, knew the house with the overgrown lawn and the newspapers that sometimes piled up for days. The neighborhood had whispered about the man who'd lost his son in the same shooting that took Tommy, but Sarah had been too buried in her own grief to reach out. Policy requires me to contact the registered owner before any action can be taken, Brady said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was looking at the dogs with new eyes, taking in details he'd missed before. The systematic pattern of scars on the shepherd's muzzle, the way both animals flinched at sudden movements, the infected wound on the pit mix that bore the telltale marks of repeated trauma. Dr. Rodriguez arrived like an answer to prayer, her mobile veterinary unit pulling up just as Brady was reaching for his radio. She emerged from the van with the confident stride of someone who'd spent years reading animal body language and human nature in equal measure. Elena Rodriguez was 43, a first-generation Mexican-American who'd built her practice on the belief that good veterinary care shouldn't depend on a pet owner's zip code. "Officer Brady," she nodded professionally, then turned to Sarah. "Show me what we're dealing with." The examination was swift but thorough. Dr. Rodriguez's hands moved with practiced efficiency, her touch gentle but decisive as she assessed the extent of the injuries. The pit mix, Elena estimated her age at around 3 years, had multiple infected wounds, evidence of malnutrition, and what appeared to be old fractures in her ribs that had healed poorly. The German Shepherd bore the subtle signs of systematic abuse. Pressure sores on his joints from being kept in cramped conditions, worn teeth from excessive crate biting, and a pattern of small scars that spoke of something beyond training accidents. "This isn't training," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying professional authority that made Brady step closer to listen. "This is systematic abuse. These injuries are consistent with repeated beatings, starvation tactics, and prolonged confinement." She looked directly at Brady. "As a veterinarian, I'm required to report suspected animal cruelty to law enforcement." The crowd that had gathered on Maple Street represented a perfect cross-section of suburban America's conflicted relationship with authority and compassion, Mrs. Henderson maintained her position that dangerous animals belonged in proper facilities, while Jake continued his live stream, his follower count climbing as the video gained traction across social media platforms. Mrs. Chen watched from her porch with the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned not to get involved in neighbors' business, but her security cameras were running, recording everything. Brady found himself caught between protocol and conscience, a position that Margaret recognized with the wisdom of someone who'd spent 40 years navigating school district bureaucracy. "Tommy," she said, using his childhood name with deliberate intent. "Sometimes the right thing and the legal thing aren't the same thing, but they should be." "I can give you 48 hours, Brady said finally, his decision clearly weighing on him. 48 hours to sort this out with the owner, get proper veterinary care documented, and file the appropriate reports. But if Mr. Coleman shows up and demands these animals back, my hands are tied. They're legally his property." Sarah felt the crushing weight of time pressing down on her. 48 hours to somehow afford emergency veterinary care she couldn't pay for, to navigate a legal system she didn't understand, and to confront a grief-stricken veteran whose pain had somehow transformed into cruelty. The mathematics of the situation seemed impossible, but as she looked into the German Shepherd's blue eyes, she recognized something she'd thought she'd lost forever. The fierce determination that had once driven her to check under beds for monsters and fight school boards for better crossing guards. 48 hours, she agreed, not knowing how she'd make it work, only knowing that she had to try. The German Shepherd seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. He moved closer to Sarah, pressing his considerable weight against her legs, and for the first time since Tommy's death she felt like someone, or something, actually needed her to be strong. The first night was a revelation in controlled chaos. Sarah's duplex, designed for 2 humans and occasional visiting grandchildren, suddenly housed 2 traumatized dogs whose needs went far beyond food and water. The German Shepherd, she'd started calling him Max after finding his name tag buried under matted fur, positioned himself strategically where he could see both the front door and the room where the pit mix, Bella, lay on a makeshift bed of old comforters. Dr. Rodriguez had administered emergency antibiotics and pain medication, but the bill, $847, represented more money than Sarah had seen in one place since the divorce. She'd paid with a credit card that was already screaming warnings about over-limit fees, knowing that tomorrow would bring its own financial reckonings. But as she watched Max's vigilant protection of Bella, something Margaret had said echoed in her mind. Some things are more important than money. The investigation began at dawn. Sarah's laptop, a 7-year-old Dell that took 5 minutes to boot up, became her command center as she dove into research about K9 Unit 447. The Cleveland Police Department's website yielded basic information. Max had been in service for 4 years, specialized in explosive detection and school security, honorably discharged in 2021 following an incident that the records didn't specify. It was Jake Morrison who provided the breakthrough. The 19-year-old appeared at her door at 8 a.m. with coffee, donuts, and a laptop that looked like something from NASA. "Mrs. Mitchell, you need to see this," he said, settling onto her couch with the casual confidence of someone who'd grown up expecting technology to solve everything. His fingers flew across the keyboard, navigating databases and social media archives with native fluency. Within an hour, he'd assembled a digital dossier that would have impressed a private detective. Max's service record included commendations for preventing 3 separate security threats at schools across the Cleveland district. He'd been trained in crowd control, explosive detection, and child protection protocols. His handler, Officer Rebecca Martinez, had retired the same year Max was discharged. "Here's where it gets interesting," Jake said, pulling up a news article from 3 years ago. Officer Martinez tried to adopt Max when he was retired, but there was some kind of bureaucratic snafu. The city had a program placing retired canines with veterans, and David Coleman's application was approved first. Sarah stared at the photograph accompanying the article. David Coleman receiving Max at a small ceremony, both man and dog, looking exhausted, as if they were going through motions neither fully understood. Coleman was younger in the photo, his military bearings still intact, but there was something hollow in his eyes that spoke of losses too fresh to process. Margaret's Alzheimer's had taken an odd turn overnight. Instead of her usual morning confusion, she'd awakened with startling clarity, as if the crisis had somehow sharpened her focus. She'd made phone calls, actual phone calls, using an address book she hadn't touched in months, to former colleagues, city council members, and what seemed like half the retired teachers in Ohio. "I found Rebecca Martinez," Margaret announced, appearing in the kitchen with the triumphant expression of someone who'd just solved a particularly challenging crossword puzzle. "She's working private security now, but she's willing to meet with you this afternoon." The meeting took place at a small cafe on Detroit Avenue, the kind of place where longtime residents discussed neighborhood politics over coffee that had been brewing since the Carter administration. Rebecca Martinez was a compact woman in her 50s, with steel gray hair and the watchful eyes of someone who'd spent years reading potential threats. She wore her retirement uneasily, like a uniform that didn't quite fit. "Max was the best partner I ever had," she said without preamble, stirring sugar into her coffee with mechanical precision. "Smart, loyal, dedicated, he had an almost supernatural ability to read children's moods. Kids who were scared, angry, hurt, he could spot them from across a playground and somehow knew exactly how to approach them." Sarah leaned forward. "What happened at Westfield Elementary? The official reports are vague." Rebecca's expression darkened. What happened was that Max wasn't officially on duty that day. He was supposed to be in routine training exercises at the academy. But when the call came in about an active shooter, he was the closest K-9 unit to the scene. She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. Protocol said to wait for backup, but Max heard children screaming. He made the decision to go in. The story that emerged was both heroic and heartbreaking. Max had breached the school's security perimeter alone, navigating hallways filled with chaos and terror. He'd found 3 children hiding in a supply closet and stayed with them until human officers arrived. But by the time he reached the classroom where the worst of the shooting had occurred, it was over. 8 children were dead, including Tommy Mitchell and Michael Coleman. The department tried to make it sound like Max had acted outside protocol, Rebecca continued, her voice bitter with old anger. They needed someone to blame for not preventing the tragedy, and a dog who'd acted on instinct was a convenient target. Max was quietly retired, and I was encouraged to take early retirement for supporting him. Sarah felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. David Coleman lost his son that day. Michael was 7, same age as several of the other victims. Autistic, nonverbal, but brilliant. David's wife left him 6 months after the funeral. Couldn't handle his grief, his anger, his need to blame someone. Rebecca's hands wrapped around her coffee cup as if seeking warmth. When David applied to adopt Max, I tried to warn the placement committee. A grieving parent shouldn't be responsible for the dog he blames for not saving his child. But the program was understaffed, underfunded, and David's military record was exemplary. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. David Coleman wasn't just a veteran with PTSD, he was a father whose grief had curdled into something toxic, a man whose daily interaction with Max represented a constant reminder of his son's death. The systematic abuse suddenly made horrific sense. Every day David looked at the dog who was supposed to protect children and saw the animal who had failed to save Michael. That evening, Jake's live stream had evolved into something approaching a social movement. His follower count had exploded past 100,000, and his footage of Max's prayer gesture had been shared across every platform. The comments ranged from heartbroken support to angry demands for justice, but the cumulative effect was a groundswell of attention that made Sarah deeply uncomfortable. "People want to help," Jake insisted, showing her the GoFundMe page he'd created without permission. The donations were climbing steadily, $3,000, then $5,000, then $8,000 from strangers who'd been moved by a 30-second video of a traumatized dog. "Mrs. Mitchell, you're going viral. This could change everything." But viral fame came with complications Sarah hadn't anticipated. By Thursday morning, news vans had appeared on Maple Street. Reporters knocked on doors, asking neighbors for comments about the praying dog story. Mrs. Henderson, who'd initially called for the animal's removal, now found herself defending Sarah's efforts to a camera crew from Channel 5. The attention felt invasive, turning a personal crisis into public entertainment. Margaret's clarity continued, but it came with an undercurrent of urgency that scared Sarah. Her mother seemed to understand that time was running short. Not just the 48 hours Officer Brady had granted, but something more fundamental. During one of their conversations, Margaret had gripped Sarah's hand with surprising strength and said, "Honey, I won't be here much longer to help you. You need to find your purpose while I can still remember to be proud of you." Dr. Rodriguez returned for follow-up examinations, bringing with her a proposal that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. The Lakewood Animal Hospital, where she maintained privileges, had offered to provide ongoing care for Max and Bella in exchange for Sarah's volunteer services. The hospital's director, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, had been following the story and saw an opportunity to expand their community outreach programs. "We've been looking for someone to coordinate our abuse recovery program," Elena explained as she checked Bella's healing wounds. "Someone who understands trauma, who has the patience for long-term rehabilitation, The position doesn't pay much, but it comes with medical benefits and access to veterinary care. The offer represented more than employment. It was validation, purpose, a reason to wake up that went beyond daily survival. But it also required Sarah to make a commitment that terrified her. Taking the job meant publicly declaring herself an advocate for animals like Max and Bella, positioning herself in opposition to people like David Coleman, potentially facing legal challenges she wasn't prepared for. Thursday evening brought the confrontation Sarah had been dreading. David Coleman appeared at her door as the news crews were packing up their equipment, and his presence seemed to suck the oxygen from the street. He was smaller than she'd expected, maybe 5'8", with the wiry build of someone who'd learned to fight before he'd learned to think. His military bearing was still evident, but it had been corrupted by 3 years of grief and isolation into something brittle and dangerous. "Those are my dogs," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Up close, Sarah could see the toll his grief had taken. The hollow cheeks, the bloodshot eyes, the tremor in his hands that spoke of too much alcohol and too little sleep. "I have the paperwork. You have no legal right to keep them." Max's reaction to David's voice was immediate and heartbreaking. The dog, who had been slowly learning to relax over the past 2 days, immediately dropped into a submissive crouch, his body language screaming terror. Bella, despite her injuries, struggled to her feet and positioned herself behind Max, seeking protection from the man who had been supposed to care for them. "I know about Michael," Sarah said quietly, the words hanging between them like a bridge neither wanted to cross. "I know what you lost that day. I lost my son too." For a moment David's armor cracked and Sarah saw the grieving father beneath the anger. "You don't know anything," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You weren't there. You didn't see what that dog failed to do." The crowd that had gathered, neighbors, reporters, curious onlookers, created an amphitheater for a confrontation that neither Sarah nor David had asked for. Margaret appeared beside her daughter with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades managing crises in overcrowded classrooms. "Son," she said, addressing David with the same tone she'd once used for troubled students, "grief makes us do things that our better selves would be ashamed of, but it's never too late to choose differently." David's response was immediate and vicious. "Don't you dare lecture me about grief, old woman. Your daughter has no idea what real loss looks like." But even as he spoke, his eyes found Max, and something in his expression shifted. The dog was trembling, pressing himself against Sarah's legs, seeking protection from the person who should have provided it. The standoff lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours. David had the law on his side. The dogs were legally his property, and Sarah had no standing to challenge his ownership. But he also had 48 hours' worth of photographic evidence documenting their abuse, a growing social media movement demanding justice, and a community that had witnessed his cruelty firsthand. 48 hours, Officer Brady had said, and now 36 of those hours had passed. David Coleman had 12 hours to reclaim his property, or Sarah would have legal grounds to pursue custody through the courts. But 12 hours felt both infinite and impossibly brief, a countdown to a confrontation that would determine whether love could triumph over law, whether healing was possible for creatures too broken to hope for it. As David walked away, his footsteps echoing off the suburban asphalt, Sarah realized that the real battle was just beginning. The viral explosion happened overnight, transforming Sarah's small neighborhood crisis into a national phenomenon that she never could have anticipated. Jake's original video had been shared by a celebrity animal rights activist with 12 million followers, and by Friday morning, Praying Dog Max was trending across multiple platforms. The GoFundMe had surpassed $50,000, with donations pouring in from strangers around the world who'd been moved by 30 seconds of footage showing a traumatized animal's desperate plea for help. But fame, Sarah discovered, was a double-edged sword that cut both ways. While thousands of people were sending money and messages of support, an equally vocal contingent was demanding to know why she thought she had the right to steal a veteran's legally owned property. Comment sections devolved into ugly debates about animal rights versus property rights, with David Coleman becoming either a villain or a victim, depending on which narrative resonated with individual viewers. The Lakewood County Courthouse had seen its share of unusual cases over the decades, but Judge Patricia Williams, a 58-year-old Army veteran herself, found herself presiding over a hearing that felt more like a social media trial than a legal proceeding. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds gathering outside holding signs that ranged from "Justice for Max" to "Support our veterans." Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table with a court-appointed attorney who'd volunteered his services after seeing the story on the morning news. David Coleman sat across the aisle with a legal aid lawyer, his military decorations displayed prominently on his chest: a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, ribbons that spoke of service and sacrifice that seemed to mock the current circumstances. The evidence against David was overwhelming and heartbreaking. Dr. Rodriguez testified about the systematic pattern of abuse she'd documented, showing photographs that made several jurors visibly wince. The infected wounds on Bella, the psychological trauma evident in Max's behavior, the malnutrition and evidence of prolonged confinement, it painted a picture of cruelty that seemed impossible to defend. But David's lawyer presented a different narrative, one that complicated the seemingly clear-cut case. David Coleman was a decorated veteran struggling with PTSD, a grieving father who'd lost his only child in a mass shooting, a man whose mental health had been neglected by the same system that had handed him two traumatized animals to care for. And the Veteran Placement Program had provided no follow-up support, no training for handling animals with their own psychological wounds, no resources for someone dealing with his own trauma. "My client is not a monster," his lawyer argued, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd seen too many veterans failed by the systems meant to support them. "He's a broken man who was given responsibility for broken animals without the tools to help either himself or them heal. This is a systemic failure, not individual cruelty." Margaret's testimony proved to be the emotional centerpiece of the hearing. Despite her Alzheimer's, she took the stand with the dignity of someone who'd spent 4 decades advocating for children who couldn't advocate for themselves. Her memory might have been failing, but her moral clarity remained sharp as a blade. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying the authority that had once silenced unruly school boards, "I've seen enough hurt children in my lifetime to recognize hurt animals. These creatures have been broken by someone who was supposed to protect them. The law may say they're property, but God's law says we're responsible for the innocent in our care." The cross-examination was brutal but necessary. David's lawyer had to establish that Margaret's Alzheimer's made her testimony unreliable, that her emotional investment in the case clouded her judgment. But Margaret's responses, delivered with the patience of someone who'd answered hostile questions from parents and administrators for decades, remained consistent and devastating. When David himself took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. He'd cleaned up for the appearance, his military bearing restored, his uniform pressed, his medals gleaming. But the man beneath the facade was clearly struggling. His testimony began as a defense of his actions, an explanation of how grief and PTSD had affected his judgment, how the animals reminded him daily of his failure to protect his son. "Michael was everything to me," he said, his voice breaking on his son's name. "He was autistic, nonverbal, but he understood everything. He loved animals, especially dogs. When I was deployed, my wife would send me videos of Michael playing with our neighbor's golden retriever. He had this laugh. David's composure cracked completely. When he died, when that dog failed to save him, I couldn't look at Max without seeing Michael's face, without remembering that I wasn't there to protect him. The admission was devastating in its honesty. David Coleman wasn't defending his actions. He was confessing to them, acknowledging the cycle of pain that had transformed him from protector to abuser. His breakdown on the witness stand was complete and public, broadcast live on local television and streamed across social media platforms where millions of viewers watched a man confront the worst version of himself. Sarah found herself in the impossible position of feeling compassion for the man who had tortured the animals she was trying to save. David's grief was real, his trauma legitimate, his service to his country honorable. But those facts couldn't erase the systematic cruelty that Max and Bella had endured, couldn't justify the transformation of innocent animals into vessels for his anger and pain. The court's decision was swift and decisive. Judge Williams, drawing on her own military experience and her understanding of both service-related trauma and animal welfare law, granted temporary custody of both animals to Sarah pending a comprehensive evaluation period. David would be required to undergo intensive mental health treatment and anger management counseling. If he successfully completed the program and could demonstrate his ability to provide appropriate care, he could petition for the animal's return. But the legal victory felt hollow as Sarah watched David leave the courthouse, his shoulders bent under the weight of public humiliation and private anguish. The man who emerged from the building bore little resemblance to the angry veteran who'd appeared at her door demanding his property. This was a broken father who'd lost his son, his wife, his sense of purpose, and now his connection to the animals that represented both his guilt and his grief. The media circus that followed the hearing was overwhelming. News crews from 3 states had descended on Lakewood, transforming the quiet suburb into a temporary stage for debates about veteran care, animal rights, and the intersection of personal trauma and public responsibility. Sarah found herself thrust into a spotlight she'd never sought, fielding interview requests from national news programs and animal welfare organizations. Margaret's condition deteriorated rapidly following the stress of her court appearance. The clarity that had sustained her through the crisis began to fade, replaced by confusion and agitation that broke Sarah's heart. During one of her lucid moments, she gripped Sarah's hand with surprising strength and delivered what felt like a benediction. "You found your purpose, honey. I can rest easy knowing that." The GoFundMe had reached $75,000, an amount that represented financial security Sarah hadn't experienced since before her divorce. But the money came with strings attached, public expectations, accountability to thousands of donors who expected updates and transparency about how their contributions were being used. Sarah had never wanted to be a public figure, never sought the responsibility of representing a cause larger than herself. Dr. Rodriguez's proposal to join the Lakewood Animal Hospital became more than a job offer. It was a lifeline. The position would provide structure for Sarah's new role as an advocate for abused animals, legitimate credentials for the work she'd stumbled into, and a professional framework for the rehabilitation programs that were clearly needed for animals like Max and Bella. But accepting the position meant acknowledging that her life had changed irrevocably. The quiet widow caring for her aging mother had become a public figure, an advocate, a symbol of something larger than herself. The transformation was both empowering and terrifying, offering purpose while demanding sacrifices she wasn't sure she was prepared to make. The evening after the hearing, as news crews packed up their equipment and the crowds dispersed, Sarah sat on her front porch with Max and Bella flanking her like furry sentinels. The German Shepherd's blue eyes had lost some of their haunted quality, while Bella's tail actually wagged when Jake approached with his evening update on social media metrics. The viral fame was already beginning to fade. New stories, fresh outrages, and different causes were competing for the internet's notoriously short attention span. But the money remained, the legal victory stood, and most importantly, two traumatized animals were beginning the long journey toward healing. As the sun set over suburban Cleveland, painting the sky in shades of hope and possibility, Sarah realized that while she'd saved Max and Bella, they had somehow managed to save her too. The woman who'd felt invisible and purposeless just a week earlier now had a mission, a calling, and a reason to wake up each morning that went beyond mere survival. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time in 3 years, Sarah Mitchell felt truly alive. The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the court hearing. Sarah jerked awake to the harsh ring of her landline, the only phone Margaret would answer consistently, her heart immediately racing with the dread that accompanies middle-of-the-night calls. Dr. Patricia Chen's voice was professionally gentle but couldn't soften the devastating words. Margaret had suffered a massive stroke during her sleep at the assisted living facility. She was alive, but the prognosis was grim. Sarah arrived at Cleveland General Hospital to find her mother connected to machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical persistence, her vibrant spirit trapped inside a body that could no longer respond. Margaret's eyes were open but vacant, staring at a ceiling that held no answers, no recognition, no trace of the fierce woman who'd spent 40 years shaping young minds and defending the defenseless. The neurologist, Dr. Michael Reeves, was a kind man in his 50s who'd delivered this type of news too many times. The stroke was extensive, he explained, his voice carrying the weight of practiced compassion. The damage to her cognitive centers is severe. Even if she recovers some motor function, the woman you knew, her memories, her personality, her ability to recognize you, that's likely gone. Sarah felt something fundamental break inside her chest, a snapping that wasn't physical but felt more real than any bone fracture. Margaret had been her anchor through the divorce, her support during Tommy's death, her moral compass during the crisis with Max and Bella. Now, just as Sarah was finding her footing in a new life, the woman who'd believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself was slipping away into a fog that no amount of love could penetrate. The timing felt deliberately cruel. The Lakewood Animal Hospital had officially offered Sarah the position as Director of Animal Trauma Recovery, a role that would have been unimaginable just a month earlier. The job came with a modest salary, full benefits, and the opportunity to develop programs for animals like Max and Bella who carried psychological wounds that standard veterinary care couldn't address. But accepting the position meant committing to a future that Margaret might not be lucid enough to witness or understand. Max seemed to sense the shift in Sarah's emotional landscape with the supernatural intuition that had made him an exceptional police dog. He began following her more closely, pressing his considerable weight against her legs during moments when grief threatened to overwhelm her completely. His prayer gesture, once a heartbreaking plea for mercy, had evolved into something that looked more like comfort. Front paws pressed together, head tilted slightly, blue eyes radiating a compassion that seemed almost human. The GoFundMe donations had plateaued at $78,000, a sum that represented both miraculous generosity and crushing responsibility. Thousands of people had invested in a story of redemption and hope, expecting updates and outcomes that Sarah wasn't sure she could provide. The money could cover Margaret's extended care, or it could fund the animal rehabilitation programs that were desperately needed, but it couldn't do both. Every financial decision felt like a betrayal of someone who was counting on her. David Coleman's court-ordered therapy sessions had begun, but early reports from his counselor suggested a man barely holding himself together. The public humiliation of the hearing, combined with the loss of the animals that had somehow anchored his daily routine, had sent him spiraling into a depression that worried his treatment team. His therapist, Dr. Sarah Washington, had contacted Sarah directly to discuss what she called a critical intervention opportunity. "David is at a crossroads," Dr. Washington explained during their phone conversation. "He can either use this crisis as a catalyst for genuine healing, or he can retreat so far into isolation that we might lose him completely. He's been asking about the dogs obsessively, not from a possessive standpoint, but from genuine concern about their well-being. I think a supervised visit might benefit everyone involved." The suggestion horrified Sarah initially. David Coleman had systematically abused Max and Bella, had transformed their existence into a daily nightmare of fear and pain. The idea of allowing him anywhere near them felt like a betrayal of everything she'd fought to accomplish. But Max's reaction to David's name during their conversation was unexpected. Instead of the fear response she'd anticipated, the dog had tilted his head with something that looked almost like concern. Margaret's decline accelerated with devastating speed. The woman who'd testified so powerfully just weeks earlier now couldn't recognize her own daughter, couldn't remember her own name, couldn't perform the basic functions that defined human dignity. Sarah found herself making decisions about feeding tubes and life support, choices that felt too massive for any one person to bear alone. The assisted living facility where Margaret had lived for the past year felt hollow without her commanding presence. Sarah spent an afternoon packing her mother's belongings, photo albums filled with decades of students, thank you cards from families whose children she'd championed, awards from teaching organizations that recognized her dedication to education and child welfare. Each item told the story of a life devoted to making the world better for the most vulnerable, a legacy that seemed to demand Sarah continue the work in her own way. Jake Morrison had evolved from neighborhood teenager to unofficial social media manager for what had become known as the Lakewood Animal Recovery Initiative. His videos documenting Max and Bella's healing process had attracted the attention of animal welfare organizations across the country, and his natural charisma had made him a surprisingly effective advocate for trauma-informed animal care. But even Jake, with his teenage optimism and digital native problem-solving skills, couldn't navigate the emotional complexity of Margaret's decline. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said during one of his daily check-ins, his usual confidence replaced by the uncertain concern of someone still learning how to offer comfort, "I know this is like the worst possible time, but the Animal Planet people want to do a documentary about Max, about the whole story. They're talking about a 6-figure deal that could fund the rehabilitation center for years." The documentary opportunity represented everything Sarah both wanted and feared. National exposure could transform their small local success into a model for animal trauma recovery programs across the country. But it also meant signing over control of their story to producers who might prioritize drama over healing, sensation over genuine progress. Margaret's voice echoed in her memory. "Some things are more important than money, honey." Dr. Rodriguez had been monitoring Bella's recovery, with the careful attention of someone who understood that physical healing was only part of the process. The pit mix's wounds had healed cleanly, but her psychological recovery was more complicated. She still flinched at sudden movements, still sought constant reassurance from Max, still trembled when strangers approached too quickly. Her progress was measurable but fragile, dependent on consistency and patience that could be disrupted by any major change in routine or environment. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening when Sarah returned from the hospital to find Max standing in Margaret's bedroom, his massive frame filling the doorway as he stared at the empty bed where her mother had spent her final weeks at home. The dog's low whine carried a grief that seemed to mirror Sarah's own, and for the first time since the stroke, she allowed herself to break down completely. Sitting on the floor of her mother's room with Max pressed against her side and Bella curled in her lap, Sarah finally understood the full weight of what she'd taken on. She wasn't just responsible for two traumatized animals. She'd become the guardian of a community's hope, the steward of donations from thousands of strangers, the reluctant spokesperson for a cause that demanded more strength than she possessed. Margaret died on a Friday morning as autumn painted the Cleveland suburbs in shades of gold and rust. Sarah was holding her hand when the machines finally fell silent, when the woman who'd shaped her moral foundation took her last breath and left behind a daughter who felt utterly unprepared for the work that lay ahead. The funeral drew an unexpected crowd. Former students, now middle-aged adults with children of their own, came to honor the teacher who'd believed in them when no one else would. Colleagues from 4 decades of education shared stories of Margaret's fierce advocacy for struggling students, her willingness to spend her own money on supplies and food for children whose families couldn't provide them. But it was Jake who delivered the most powerful tribute, speaking about how Margaret's belief in second chances had inspired the entire community to rally around Max and Bella. As Sarah stood beside her mother's grave, watching the casket being lowered into ground that would soon freeze with winter's approach, she felt the crushing weight of inheritance, not just Margaret's modest estate, but the responsibility to carry forward a legacy of compassion and advocacy that had defined her mother's life. Max stood beside her throughout the service, his presence solid and warm against her leg. When the final prayers were spoken and the last shovelful of earth was placed, the dog performed his prayer gesture one final time, not for mercy, not for help, but as what looked unmistakably like a salute to a woman who'd understood that protecting the innocent was the highest calling any creature could embrace. The work would continue, but Sarah would have to find the strength to carry it forward alone. The revelation came on a gray November morning when Dr. Washington called with information that shattered every assumption Sarah had held about David Coleman's story. The therapist's voice carried the weight of someone who'd uncovered a truth too devastating to keep secret, but too important to ignore. "Sarah, I need you to sit down for this," Dr. Washington began, her professional composure barely masking personal distress. "David has been lying to everyone. The court, his lawyers, even himself in some ways. The abuse of Max and Bella wasn't random cruelty or displaced grief. It was systematic conditioning, and it started the day he brought them home." The police report that followed painted a picture so disturbing that Sarah had to read it twice before the words registered. David Coleman hadn't just been grieving his son's death, he'd been methodically recreating the trauma that had killed Michael, using Max and Bella as unwitting proxies in a twisted psychological experiment designed to somehow undo his failure as a father. Security footage from David's neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had captured months of training sessions that were actually elaborate psychological torture. David had been conditioning Max to respond to school shooting scenarios, forcing the retired K-9 to relive the day at Westfield Elementary over and over again. The prayer position that had made Max famous wasn't learned helplessness. It was a desperate attempt to communicate that he understood the exercise, that he remembered the children he couldn't save, that he was sorry for failing. He was trying to train Max to go back in time, Dr. Washington explained, her voice breaking with professional anguish. David believed that if he could make Max perfect, if he could eliminate every possible failure response, somehow it would retroactively save Michael. The abuse wasn't punishment, it was preparation for a mission that could never be completed. The depth of David's delusion was staggering. He'd constructed an elaborate fantasy where Max's retirement was temporary, where the dog would eventually be called back into service to prevent another school shooting, where his conditioning would transform the animal into a perfect protector who could save children the way he'd failed to save Michael. Bella had been included as a civilian casualty in his training scenarios, representing the innocent bystanders that police dogs must protect while pursuing their primary mission. Sarah felt sick as she absorbed the implications. Every beating, every moment of starvation, every terrifying exercise had been David's attempt to forge Max into an impossible standard of canine heroism. The man hadn't been taking out his grief on helpless animals. He'd been trying to resurrect his dead son through the systematic torture of creatures who reminded him of his failure. The psychiatric evaluation revealed the full extent of David's psychological break from reality. Dr. Emily Rodriguez, the court-appointed psychiatrist, diagnosed him with severe PTSD complicated by delusional disorder and complex grief syndrome. His military training had provided him with the tactical knowledge to design realistic training scenarios, while his untreated trauma had convinced him that such scenarios were not only necessary but noble. Mr. Coleman genuinely believes he was preparing Max to save lives, Dr. Rodriguez explained during her testimony. In his distorted worldview, the abuse was actually heroic preparation. He saw himself as a demanding but caring trainer, like the drill sergeants who'd shaped him into an effective soldier. The fact that Max and Bella were terrified wasn't cruelty to him. It was appropriate respect for the gravity of their mission. The revelation recontextualized everything about the case, transforming David from a villain into a victim of his own psychological wounds. The man who'd appeared at Sarah's door demanding his property wasn't an abuser defending his right to torture animals. He was a delusional father desperately trying to complete a mission that existed only in his fractured mind. But understanding David's motivations didn't diminish the trauma he'd inflicted on Max and Bella. If anything, the systematic nature of their abuse made their recovery more complicated. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the veterinary behaviorist treating both animals, explained that they'd been conditioned to expect violence disguised as training, affection mixed with terror, safety that could transform into danger without warning. Max has been living in a state of constant hypervigilance, Dr. Walsh explained during one of their sessions. David's training scenarios convinced him that children are always in danger, that he's personally responsible for protecting them, and that failure results in severe punishment. His prayer gesture isn't submission. It's a complex communication attempt. He's trying to tell us that he understands the mission, accepts responsibility for past failures, and is requesting permission to try again. The breakthrough in understanding Max's behavior came when Jake accidentally dropped his phone while filming a routine therapy session. The metallic clatter triggered an immediate response from Max, not fear, but focused alertness. The dog positioned himself between Jake and the sound source, scanning for threats with the professional intensity of his police training days. But when Jake simply picked up his phone and continued recording, Max had performed his prayer gesture while maintaining eye contact, as if reporting that the potential threat had been assessed and neutralized. He's been trying to tell us he's still on duty, Sarah realized, the pieces finally clicking into place. David's training convinced him that retirement was a lie, that he's still responsible for protecting people. The prayer position is his way of filing a status report. Bella's trauma was different but equally complex. As Michael Coleman's therapy dog, she'd been trained to provide comfort and emotional support to an autistic child. David's scenarios had corrupted that training, conditioning her to associate human distress with impending violence. Every time someone showed fear or sadness in her presence, she expected to be beaten for failing to provide adequate comfort. The documentary crew from Animal Planet arrived in Cleveland just as these revelations were emerging, and their presence added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. The producers had been expecting a straightforward story of animal abuse and rescue, but they'd walked into a psychological thriller that challenged every assumption about trauma, healing, and the nature of heroism itself. Director Michael Chen, an Emmy-winning filmmaker with a reputation for sensitive handling of difficult subjects, spent hours interviewing Sarah about the ethical implications of broadcasting such deeply personal trauma. "We can tell this story in a way that honors everyone's pain," he promised, "but only if you're comfortable with the world seeing the full complexity of what happened here." The decision to participate in the documentary felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. Sarah could retreat into privacy, protect her family's story from public consumption, and focus on the quiet work of healing. Or she could expose everything: Margaret's decline, David's delusions, her own transformation from invisible widow to reluctant advocate, in the hope that sharing their pain might prevent similar tragedies. Jake had become Sarah's unofficial advisor on media strategy, and his perspective carried the wisdom of someone who'd grown up understanding that personal stories could become public property in the digital age. "Mrs. Mitchell, people need to see this," he argued during one of their evening conversations. "Not for entertainment, but because there are probably other David Colemans out there, other veterans who got broken animals instead of support, other families dealing with trauma nobody understands." The most difficult revelation came when Dr. Washington shared David's therapy recordings, audio files where a broken man tried to explain his actions to professionals who couldn't quite grasp the depth of his delusion. In one particularly heartbreaking session, David described watching Max perform the prayer gesture and interpreting it as the dog's request for more challenging training exercises. "He's telling me he's ready for advanced scenarios," David had explained to his therapist, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who believed they'd achieved a breakthrough. "The prayer position means he accepts responsibility for past failures and requests permission to prove his improvement. It's exactly what we taught police dogs to do when they'd completed a task successfully." Sarah listened to hours of these recordings, each one revealing new layers of David's psychological architecture. He'd created an elaborate mythology around Max's service record, convinced himself that the dog's retirement was a temporary punishment that could be reversed through proper conditioning. Every beating had been administered with the careful precision of someone who believed they were forging a weapon capable of preventing future tragedies. The most devastating recording was David's description of the day he'd first brought Max and Bella home. He'd researched their backgrounds obsessively, learning about Max's service record and Bella's training as a therapy dog. In his mind, he'd been chosen by destiny to prepare these animals for their true calling, preventing another Westfield Elementary massacre. "I knew they were special the moment I saw them," David had told his therapist. Max had the training, the experience, the genetic predisposition for protection work. Bella had the emotional intelligence needed to recognize distressed children. Together, they could become the perfect team, a police dog and therapy dog working in coordination to prevent tragedies before they occurred. The reality of David's planning was both impressive and terrifying. He'd studied school shooting protocols, researched canine behavior modification techniques, and designed training scenarios that would have been sophisticated even by professional standards. His military background had provided him with the tactical knowledge to create realistic simulations, while his engineering degree had helped him construct elaborate training environments in his basement and backyard. But the foundation of his entire project was a delusion so fundamental that no amount of careful planning could overcome it. David believed that sufficient preparation could prevent random acts of violence, that perfect training could eliminate human evil, that the systematic conditioning of two traumatized animals could somehow resurrect his dead son and undo the worst day of his life. As Sarah absorbed these revelations, she felt her understanding of justice, mercy, and responsibility shifting beneath her feet. David Coleman wasn't the monster she'd imagined. He was a father so broken by loss that he'd constructed an elaborate fantasy to avoid confronting the truth that some tragedies couldn't be prevented, some children couldn't be saved, and some failures were too large for any amount of subsequent heroism to erase. The question that haunted her wasn't whether David deserved forgiveness, but whether anyone, human or animal, could fully recover from trauma so systematic and profound. Max and Bella had been shaped by months of abuse disguised as training, while David had been shaped by years of grief disguised as purpose. They were all victims of a tragedy that had occurred 3 years earlier in an elementary school classroom, all struggling to find meaning in a loss that defied comprehension. The truth was more complicated than any documentary could capture, more nuanced than any legal verdict could address, and more heartbreaking than any viral video could convey. But it was also, Sarah realized, the foundation upon which genuine healing would have to be built. Spring arrived in Cleveland like a gentle promise, painting the suburbs in shades of hope that had seemed impossible during the long winter of grief and revelation. 6 months had passed since Margaret's death. 4 months since David's psychological evaluation had rewritten the narrative of Max and Bella's abuse, and 3 months since Sarah had made the decision that would define the rest of her life. The Lakewood Animal Trauma Recovery Center occupied the converted warehouse that had once housed Margaret's beloved community garden project. Sarah had used the documentary money, $150,000 from Animal Planet plus another $200,000 in donations sparked by the film's Emmy nomination, to create something her mother would have understood, a place where broken creatures could learn to trust again, where healing happened not through force but through patience, where the most damaged souls received the most careful attention. Max had become the center's unofficial mascot and its most successful case study. The German Shepherd, who had once trembled in prayer positions, now moved through the facility with quiet confidence, his distinctive blue eyes alert but calm. Dr. Jennifer Walsh's behavior modification program had slowly helped him understand that his police service was truly over, that his responsibility for protecting children existed now in a different form. As a therapy dog who could recognize trauma in newly arrived animals and somehow communicate that survival was possible. The transformation hadn't been linear or easy. There had been setbacks, nights when Max would wake from nightmares, searching the facility for threats that existed only in his conditioned memory, mornings when the sound of children's laughter from the nearby elementary school would send him into hyper-alert mode. But gradually, with the patient consistency that trauma recovery demanded, he'd learned to distinguish between past and present, between David's training scenarios and the genuine safety of his new environment. Bella's recovery had followed a different trajectory, one that spoke to the particular cruelty of her conditioning as a therapy dog whose comfort instincts had been weaponized against her. She'd spent months flinching away from anyone who showed signs of distress, her natural empathy corrupted by David's training into a trigger for fear. But slowly, through Dr. Walsh's careful work, she'd begun to reclaim her original purpose, offering comfort without expecting punishment, recognizing human emotion without anticipating violence. The center now housed 17 animals, each carrying their own catalog of human-inflicted trauma. There was Caesar, a pit bull rescued from a dogfighting ring who'd been taught that survival meant violence. Luna, a golden retriever whose previous owners had used shock collars to train behaviors that existed only in their paranoid imagination. Storm, a German Shepherd mix who'd been abandoned after biting a child, later discovered to have been defending himself against systematic abuse by that same child's older brother. Sarah's role had evolved from reluctant rescuer to something approaching an expert in animal trauma psychology. She'd completed her veterinary technician certification through night classes, spent countless hours studying under Dr. Walsh's mentorship, and developed an intuitive understanding of how broken trust could be rebuilt through consistent kindness. The transformation from invisible widow to recognized advocate still felt surreal, but the work itself had become as natural as breathing. The most unexpected development had been David Coleman's integration into the center's rehabilitation program. His court-ordered therapy had progressed to the point where supervised visits were not only possible, but beneficial for all parties involved. Under careful psychological supervision, David had begun working with animals other than Max and Bella. Creatures whose trauma he couldn't project his own delusions onto, whose healing he could support without the weight of his son's death complicating every interaction. The first meeting between David and Max had been orchestrated with the precision of a surgical procedure. Dr. Washington and Dr. Walsh had prepared for months, establishing protocols and safety measures that prioritized everyone's psychological well-being. Sarah had been skeptical, her protective instincts screaming against allowing the man who'd tortured these animals anywhere near them again. But Max's reaction had been the revelation that changed everything. Instead of fear or aggression, the dog had approached David with what could only be described as forgiveness, not the mindless acceptance of an abused animal, but the conscious choice of a creature who understood that the man before him was as broken as he had been, as much in need of healing as any animal in the facility. David's breakdown during that first meeting had been complete and cathartic. Faced with Max's gentle approach, with the absence of fear in eyes that had once held nothing but terror, he'd finally confronted the full reality of what his delusions had cost. The man who'd convinced himself he was training heroes had seen clearly, perhaps for the first time, that he'd been torturing innocents. "I'm sorry," he'd whispered, his voice breaking as Max cautiously approached. "I'm so sorry. I thought I was helping you become stronger. I thought I was preparing you to save children the way I couldn't save Michael. I was so lost, so broken, that I broke you too." Max's response had been to perform his prayer gesture one final time, but the meaning had transformed completely. Instead of desperate pleading or trauma response, it had looked like benediction, like a creature offering absolution to someone who'd hurt him but was genuinely seeking redemption. The documentary, Healing Broken Trust, had premiered to critical acclaim and unexpected controversy. Some viewers were outraged by its sympathetic portrayal of David, arguing that understanding his psychological state somehow excused his actions. Others were moved by its unflinching examination of how trauma could cascade through families and communities, creating cycles of pain that required conscious intervention to break. Sarah had been invited to speak at veterinary conferences and animal welfare symposiums across the country, sharing the center's approach to trauma-informed care and challenging traditional assumptions about animal rehabilitation. The shy librarian, who'd once felt invisible, had become a reluctant expert, whose insights were reshaping how professionals understood the intersection of human and animal psychology. Jake Morrison had graduated from high school with early admission to Ohio State's journalism program, but he'd deferred enrollment to spend a gap year documenting the center's work. His social media presence had evolved from teenage activism to sophisticated advocacy, and his upcoming book about the Max and Bella case had already attracted interest from major publishers. The boy who'd started filming out of curiosity had become a voice for animals who couldn't speak for themselves. The center's success had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Veterans organizations had begun referring traumatized soldiers for animal-assisted therapy programs, recognizing that the healing relationship could flow in both directions. Social workers were sending families dealing with domestic violence to learn about trust rebuilding from creatures who'd survived systematic abuse. The warehouse that had once been Margaret's garden was growing something different but equally vital: hope for beings who'd forgotten how to hope. Margaret's presence remained woven throughout the facility in ways both obvious and subtle. Her photograph hung in the main office, surrounded by thank you letters from families whose lives had been touched by the center's work. Her favorite saying, "Some things are more important than money," had been painted on the wall where staff and volunteers gathered for their morning meetings. But more than these visible memorials, her spirit lived in the center's fundamental philosophy that every creature deserved patience, understanding, and the chance to heal at their own pace. The financial reality of running such a facility remained challenging, despite the documentary money and ongoing donations. Each animal required specialized care, behavioral therapy, and sometimes months of rehabilitation before they could be safely placed in new homes. Sarah had learned to navigate grant applications, fundraising events, and the complex politics of animal welfare organizations, skills she'd never imagined needing but had proved essential for sustaining the work. The most profound measure of the center's success wasn't financial or statistical. It was the quiet moments that occurred when healing breakthrough occurred. Max teaching a newly arrived dog that human hands could offer comfort instead of pain. Bella demonstrating to a traumatized cat that emotional support was possible without punishment. David working patiently with an aggressive rescue, his own journey toward healing reflected in his gentle interactions with creatures who understood damage in ways that humans rarely could. On warm evenings, Sarah would often find herself sitting in the center's memorial garden, the space she'd created to honor Margaret and all the animals who hadn't survived their trauma. Max and Bella would flank her on either side, their presence warm and steady, while other residents of the facility played or rested in the approaching twilight. The garden faced east, toward the elementary school where Tommy had died and where Max now visited weekly as a therapy dog, helping other children process their own fears and anxieties. The circle of healing had closed in ways Sarah couldn't have imagined during those desperate first moments when she'd stopped her car on Maple Street to help two trembling dogs who seemed to be praying for salvation. As spring deepened into summer, as the center's work expanded and its reputation grew, Sarah often thought about the word Margaret had used during her testimony: purpose. The woman who'd felt invisible and unnecessary had discovered that sometimes the most important calling finds you when you're least prepared for it, arriving in the form of creatures who need exactly the kind of love you have to give. The healing continued, one broken heart at a time, in a warehouse that had become a sanctuary for beings who'd learned that trust was possible, that love could overcome fear, and that sometimes the most profound transformations happened not through force or training, but through the simple revolutionary act of refusing to give up on souls that others had written off as too damaged to save. Sometimes the most profound purpose finds us when we least expect it, arriving through trembling paws and desperate eyes that mirror our own hidden pain. Like Sarah Mitchell, many of us reach our golden years feeling invisible, questioning whether our lives still matter after children have grown and careers have ended. But Sarah's story reminds us that our deepest calling often emerges from our greatest wounds. Her loss of Tommy led her to save Max and Bella, transforming her from a grieving mother into a beacon of hope for countless broken souls. Margaret's wisdom echoes through every act of compassion. Some things are more important than money, honey. The truth is, we're never too old to discover that our scars can become our superpowers, that our experience with heartbreak uniquely qualifies us to recognize and heal it in others. Whether it's volunteering at shelters, mentoring struggling families, or simply offering a listening ear to a neighbor, our later years aren't about winding down, they're about stepping into the fullness of who we were always meant to become. Your story isn't over. It's just beginning its most meaningful chapter. What unexpected moment in your life revealed a deeper purpose you never knew you had? Have you ever found healing by helping another soul who was more broken than yourself? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.